The women's roles in taking the typically male jobs is a well-known part of World War II. Many immediately think of the iconic poster of Rosie the Riveter and the women who worked in factories, but women also became electricians, mechanics, nurses on the battlefields, soldiers, spies, and more for our country and the Allies. In this short film, we will show you how women's rights and responsibilities were expanded during the war, and talk about the lesser-known jobs that the women filled.
Some women decided to take on a very different kind of job than the history books say they did. The jobs on the home front weren't just working in factories and clerical jobs. Women started replacing men as airway traffic controllers and aircraft communicationers. The women who took on these roles were very important in keeping everything organized in the sky. It is still unknown who was the first woman to take on one of these jobs, but some think that Mary Chancellor was the first woman to be an air traffic controller. One of the reasons we don't know is because President Franklin Roosevelt gave $12,186,000 for the Aeronautics Administration, or the CAA, to control the airport traffic towers. Women started piling in, taking control of the towers. They took over managing the movements of aircraft taking off and landing, coordinating their paths to ensure safe separations, providing weather updates, issuing takeoff and landing clearances, and guiding pilots through the airspace around the airfields, all while communicating with them via radio, effectively acting as the air traffic controller for military operations at the base. Also worked as communication specialists, directing aircraft movements on the ground at airfields by communicating with pilots through the radio. Mary Chancellor was a very famous airfield controller and is very well known for taking charge in this situation. She joined in the air traffic controller in June 1942. Mary worked at the Denver Airway Traffic Controller Center. When Mary was training to be an airfield controller, she was one of 83,600 women, which was still only 40% of airfield controllers at that time. But even with mostly men working, they would not be able to do it without women. The same goes for the spies.
Spies were a big part of the war, and women were beginning to find jobs blending in and gathering information for the Allies. One specific woman is Virginia Hall. She found her way to the Special Operations Executive, or the SOE. She was offered a field job to set up resistant groups against the Nazis in France in the August of 1941. She was the first female SOE agent sent on an active field role. She posed as a dairy farmer and would scout drop zones for supplies and weapons while herding cows. She helped create a resistance group in France. Virginia was very cautious as to not get caught resisting against the Nazi. She was invited to a scheduled secret meeting of various SOE agents, but Virginia was worried that too many of these agents would be in the same place at the same time, and not all of them took security procedures as seriously as they should. She didn't go to the meeting, and her suspicions were right. The Gestapo raided the meeting and arrested 12 SOE agents, and Virginia was the only one left with a radio able to communicate to headquarters in London. Virginia Hall received the Distinguished Service Cross for her work as a spy and SOE agent. She was the only civilian woman to receive this award during World War II. Being a field agent is no easy work, but helping wounded soldiers on the battlefield is extremely important and dangerous.
When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and the U.S. joined the war, the Army Nurse Corps only had 1,000 nurses, and the Navy Nurse Corps had even less, with only 800. By the end of the war, 59,000 women nurses served in the Army Nurse Corps, and 11,000 women served in the Navy Nurse Corps. Hundreds of women were rewarded well-deserved commendations for their services, bravery, and sacrifice. Unfortunately, some died trying to help wounded soldiers, and dozens died in accidents at home and abroad. After all their hard work to even have the opportunity to serve their country. The United States began accepting women nurses not only to volunteer, but actually work in the military during World War II with the establishment of WAVES by Elizabeth Renard. WAVES stands for Women Accepted for Volunteering Emergency Services. This was established in the Navy on July 30th, 1942, when President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed the Navy's Women's Reserve Act into law. This allowed women to serve as nurses in the Navy during the war. WAVES was a group made for women to work as nurses in the Navy to free up men's personnel for sea duty. WAVES served in many roles, including clerical, hospitals, aviations, and domestic air traffic controller. They also trained them in navigation and gunnery, and fixed and maintained aircrafts.
More than 350,000 women served as soldiers. Unlike nurses who were allowed to volunteer for decades before the war, this opened up a new opportunity for women to enlist for the Army, Navy, Marine Corps, and Coast Guards. In 1942, the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps was created by Congress. It was later renamed the Women's Army Corps. The women who served in this organization were called the Women in Uniform. The women in uniforms performed more than 200 jobs during their service. Many of them risked their lives. 432 servicewomen died and 88 were taken prisoner. Many servicewomen received recognition and respect during the war, but they also faced gender discrimination from the public and male colleagues. Women of color confronted a double burden of racism and sexism. Even though the women went through a lot, the demands of a world war had created a future for American women in the armed forces. In 1948, Congress passed the Women's Armed Services Integration Act, which granted women the right to serve as regular members of the military for the first time. World War II was also a first time for women code breakers.
The U.S. desperately needed code breakers to decipher enemy codes and curate hard-to-break codes from the Allies at the beginning of the war. The U.S. wanted to hire women with a math education and some knowledge of German. The sudden need for code breakers offered new opportunities for the few women with college educations. They interviewed educated women across the country and asked 2 questions. Do you like crossword puzzles, and are you engaged to be married? If they answered that they liked crossword puzzles and that they weren't going to be married, they were offered to be trained to break enemy codes for either the U.S. Army or Navy. If they accepted the job, they were told they couldn't tell anybody what they were doing, even their families, and would often be told, "Loose lips sink ships." The women code breakers were very important to breaking the codes and winning the war. Women made up more than half of the total U.S. code breakers, weren't paid the same as the men with the same job, and contributed greatly for some of the most important codes. Genevieve Groton identified the key pattern to crack the purple cipher used by high-ranking Japanese officials. Anne Carcrice cracked the code that located Japanese supply ships where the U.S. could interfere with their supplies. Francis Steen deciphered messages that helped us locate Iroka Yamada, the Japanese admiral who planned the attack on Pearl Harbor. Virginia D. Adderholt decoded the message from the Japanese that they were going to surrender. Some of the men tried to take credit for this women's work. One of them was J. Edgar Hoover, the first director of the FBI. He claimed he broke up a Nazi spy ring in South America. The woman who actually decoded the message was Elizabeth Smith Fredman. Because these women said they wouldn't tell anybody about their work under oath, it was decades before they were recognized for their achievements.
In conclusion, women were treated a little better, but did not get that many more responsibilities. Unfortunately, women's employment was only encouraged as long as the war was on. Once the war was over, federal and civilian policies replaced women for the men that returned from war efforts. They were still allowed to have low-paying jobs like secretaries, waitresses, or in other clerical jobs. Even though not much changed, women still show that they could work the same or better than men. This was still a turning point for the women that paved the way for the women in the future to be treated equally as men.